Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. It's such a pleasure coming up from this beautiful sunshine. One of the first things we learned in school about the ancient Egyptians is that they were obsessed with death, and that their strong beliefs in judgment, salvation, and eternal life made them go to great lengths to preserve the bodies of the dead and stock their tombs with provisions for eternity. In fact, we learned, the ancient Egyptians described the journey of the soul after death in their Book of the Dead, so that we only need to look at its pictures to see that they believed in an afterlife of dangerous but rewarding trials, ultimately leading to a life of eternal bliss. On closer scrutiny, however, much of this story turns out to be supplied by the background narrative we apply, rather than in the ancient sources themselves. If we ask for a text passage explaining Egyptian beliefs in judgment and salvation, we find that these ideas are never expressed directly, but rather that if we assume them to begin with, indigenous sources can be fit into the overall narrative. My recent book, Yearning for Immortality, sets out to answer the resulting question of how we came to understand ancient Egyptian religion in terms so closely related to Christianity generally, and more specifically, characteristic 19th century Protestant ideas of an afterlife of trials and spiritual development, leading ultimately to salvation. In 1819, 3 years before Champollion announced his decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, British polymath Thomas Young published his detailed overview of the state of knowledge about ancient Egypt at the time. In his Encyclopaedia Britannica entry, one can observe a gradual shift away from the authority of the classical authors and towards an increasing emphasis on ancient Egyptian empirical material, a development that had started earlier in the 18th century, but had become significantly more feasible with the influx of objects and documentation in the wake of Napoleon's invasion from 1798 to 1801. Young was not especially concerned with ancient Egyptian mortuary religion, but he makes a significant remark that can serve as a starting point for today's investigation. In a part of his discussion where he characteristically tests the description by 1st century CE historian Diodorus of Sicily against newly unearthed evidence, he concludes that the correlation he finds, quote, demonstrates also the truth of the received opinion that the Egyptians believed in a future state of rewards and punishments, end quote. This raises two important questions that will serve to guide the first part of our investigation. Firstly, how did it happen that such a received opinion about the ancient Egyptian afterlife could have formed during preceding centuries, given that there is quite minimal evidence of the idea of postmortem judgment or rewards and punishments in the afterlife in the classical authors that served as the main evidence prior to the decipherment of hieroglyphs and systematic collection and documentation practices of the 19th century? The second question is how this basic idea, developed as it was largely without input from Egyptian sources, could survive the encounter with such sources as they did become available. Off the cuff, one might have expected such ideas to go the way of the understanding of the hieroglyphic script as bypassing human languages and expressing pure concepts, which were decisively laid to rest with Champollion's decipherment. However, as anyone who has engaged with ancient Egypt in scholarship or popular culture can attest, the idea of Egyptian mortuary religion pivoting around ideas of judgment and resulting rewards and punishments is still very much with us. To answer these questions, it's necessary to trace the main developments in the history of the overall model, a history that takes us from the Middle Ages, where its first components are established, to the late 19th century, when the present model had largely crystallized. As we'll see, a main feature of this history is that of a relatively closed system, where European concepts and concerns play a formative role, while ancient Egyptian evidence, even after the decipherment of hieroglyphs, tends to be of secondary importance and is used to fill in gaps rather than shape the overall model. The several centuries long scope of this history means that we will by necessity need to keep a brisk pace and focus on main developments and turning points. In the Middle Ages, apart from the more specialized concerns of pilgrims seeking to connect Egyptian landmarks with biblical narratives, the main interest in ancient Egyptian cultural products focused on mummified bodies. It was during this time that the familiar idea arose that the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead in order to preserve them for eternity. There were three main contributors to this idea. Firstly, it was observed that the bodies had in fact been preserved to a remarkable degree, belying their great age. It was a relatively simple step to infer that this effect was what the Egyptians sought to achieve, in other words, to conflate the purposes of the procedure with the observed results. Secondly, the black gum-like substance often observed in mummified bodies was associated with a medically efficacious asphalt that was known as mumia, giving the name to the process of mummification and the popular designation of embalmed bodies as mummies. The idea that the Egyptians treated their dead with this curative substance corroborated the idea that they sought in some sense to preserve their life force or bodily form. Thirdly, during this period, European interest in embalming techniques were on the rise, in the first instance to be able to transport bodies of deceased travelers back to their homes for burial. This background further corroborated the notion that the Egyptians' embalming was similarly meant to preserve the body. The advent of the printing press in the 15th century proved a major turning point in European intellectual history, with the ability to copy and distribute written text on an unprecedented scale. This technology led, among many other things, to a rediscovery of classical texts by a wider audience from the late 15th century onwards. A number of such texts contained observations on ancient Egyptian culture by visitors and scholars of classical antiquity. Although Egyptian mortuary religion more specifically does not seem to have been of nearly as much interest to classical authors as they would be to early modern, let alone 19th century scholars, some of the newly available texts did touch upon such topics. Chief among these was the histories of the 5th century BCE Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus. As a whole, his work describes the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean as backdrop to the Greco-Persian Wars, and among these, Book 2 is devoted in its entirety to Egypt. Herodotus wrote detailed descriptions of the technical side of Egyptian mummification, which is one of the few passages of his work that can still be found cited in recent literature as a primary source of knowledge. He also discusses practices of mourning in connection with funerals, but he has very little to say about the underlying beliefs that might have motivated these practices. An exception is found in a puzzling passage of a section in which Herodotus relates the mythical history of the early kings of Egypt. As an aside, he writes on Egyptian beliefs about the soul, for which he uses the Greek term psyche or psyche. Quote, "And the Egyptians are also the first who reported the doctrine that the soul of man is immortal, and that when the body dies, the soul enters into another creature, which chances then to be coming to the birth. And when it has gone the round of all the creatures of land and sea and of the air, it enters again into a human body as it comes to the birth, and that it makes this round in a period of 3,000 years. End quote. This gives a clear, if somewhat exotic, explanation of what the Egyptians believed happened after death. But from the perspective of the new readership of European scholars, it left something to be desired. One problem was that it did not provide any obvious explanation for the practice of mummification, which Herodotus discussed completely separately. This could, however, be remedied with a creative interpretation of Herodotus's text, so that the human body entered by the soul after the cycle of 3,000 years was not, in fact, a new body being born, but rather was the same body, which thus needed to be preserved for the intervening 3,000 years. Another way around this problem was to point out that the word used for the first body dying, the Greek kataphthino, could mean not only to perish, but also to waste away, to decay, in which case it could be assumed that the Egyptians, for whatever reason, wanted to stave off the transmigration of the soul by preventing the decay of the body. Another problem was that Herodotus's mechanical and automatic system did not seem to allow for the kind of eschatological stakes European scholars automatically associated with mortuary beliefs. Would the enormous investment in funerary practices not indicate that the future and salvation of the soul was at stake? Such an idea could easily be grafted onto Herodotus's text, however, with reference to Plato's dialogues and/or the Hermetic writings, which were also becoming known at the same time. Those texts contained different versions of an idea where different souls were reincarnated into different animals or human bodies, depending on their qualities as evidenced by their behavior during their life in human form. In this way, Herodotus could be used to establish familiar ideas in ancient Egypt, not only about the immortality of the soul, but also of a system of rewards and punishments depending on the virtues or vices exhibited during life. Once this connection had been established, it became a popular way to make sense of the otherwise somewhat odd Herodotus passage. Another highly influential passage came from the aforementioned historian Diodorus, whose work titled the Bibliotheca, or Library, presented a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world beginning from the Trojan War and the mythic past preceding it. Like Herodotus, a significant part of the historical overview focuses on the specificities of the different cultures of the area. The parts that attracted attention to European scholars interested in Egyptian mortuary religion described a ritual carried out with minor differences at the funerals of both kings and commoners. The rite proceeds as follows, quote, "Then, when the judges, 42 in number, have assembled and have taken seats in a hemicycle which has been built across the lake, the baris, a type of boat, is launched, which has been prepared in advance. At any rate, after the baris has been launched into the lake, but before the coffin containing the body is set in it, the law gives permission to anyone who wishes to arraign the dead person. Now, if anyone presents himself and makes a charge and shows that the dead man had led an evil life, the judges announce the decision to all, and the body is denied the customary burial." End quote. There is thus nothing overtly about any underlying religious beliefs, but there is a vaguer sense of the fate of the deceased being dependent on their ethical behavior during life. And like with Herodotus, this made it possible to use the passage to approach Egyptian mortuary religion to models familiar from Christianity. Fundamentally, there were two main routes available to early modern scholars in reconstructing Egyptian afterlife beliefs, depending on whether their specific purposes made it most apposite to approximate or contrast Egyptian religion to Christianity. The practices of mummification and the belief in metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls, described by Herodotus, were on the face of it clearly exotic details that were most immediately useful for writers interested in othering Egyptian religion. However, we also saw that more or less creative reinterpretations could also allow Herodotus to be approximated to Christianity as far as postmortem rewards and punishments were concerned. On the other hand, Diodorus was most immediately useful for focusing on the importance of ethical behavior and postmortem judgment, even though this judgment was of a significantly different, fundamentally human and social nature, rather than an afterlife judgment per se. A recurring theme is that of an ethical relevance to the afterlife fate of the deceased persons. This can be achieved through either or both of the creative readings we have looked at, whether a projection of Platonic ideas of different souls being reincarnated in different, more or less desirable animals onto the mechanistic description in Herodotus, or the increasing tendency to understand Diodorus as describing an afterlife judgment along Christian lines, rather than a ritual impacting reputation and right to burial. These considerations roughly stake out the territory of the 17th century understanding of Egyptian afterlife beliefs. And this is also broadly the picture that Thomas Young had in mind when referring to the received opinion in his 1819 article. However, new strands of thinking were introduced during the 18th century that largely complemented the traditional picture and set the stage for the incorporation of ancient Egyptian evidence as it gradually became available. The first of these developments is often traced back to classicist Jean Terrasant's novel Zethos, published in 1731. Among his many adventures, the eponymous protagonist Prince Zethos undergoes an initiation into a secret society of priests living and worshipping under the Great Pyramid. As part of the process, Zethos must pass a series of trials and in return gains insight into the non-supernatural true background of the myths and beliefs of non-initiates. For example, various aspects of Greek conceptions of the underworld are explained as actual social patterns in the society of initiates. Terrasant's text presents itself as a translation of an ancient manuscript and is peppered with footnotes allegedly added by the translator, but actually providing us a glimpse into the sources Terrasant drew on for his story. The text became very popular, and its image of Egypt as a society of initiates with a close association between funerary culture and initiation and mysteries resonated with the interests of Freemasons and others. The most famous outcome of this fertile intellectual ground being no doubt Mozart's opera The Magic Flute. For more mainstream scholarship as well, however, an expectation had been formed largely independent of the classical authors, or at least drawing on different ones, such as Apuleius, of a significant role of initiatory trials in ancient Egyptian funerary culture. Another development beginning at roughly the same time did not originate in thinking about ancient Egypt at all, but rather about the Christian afterlife more generally. In McDaniel and Lang's influential book, Heaven, a History, they characterize this development as an increasingly anthropocentric afterlife from the mid-18th century, though the development manifested in different ways at different times and in different denominations. Central to the changes was an increasing focus on the concrete nature of the afterlife, centered on human experiences and activities, often described as a journey or a process of spiritual betterment. Here we see a relatively late example of some of these ideas from the Anglican churchman Henry Perry Liddon. Quote, "We know that those who die in a state of grace enter not heaven as yet, but paradise, an intermediary state in which they are gradually becoming more and more ready for the fully unveiled beauty of the Most Holy. We know that just as the lost enter upon a fearful-looking form of judgment and fiery indignation, which is not yet the place of punishment, so the saved are in an antechamber of heaven, the door of which will open for them at the last great day." End quote. Here, rather than the soul being saved and going to heaven at once, Liddon operates with intermediary stages where one can, and indeed must, better oneself. As we've seen, the hitherto relatively abstract model of the ancient Egyptian afterlife had been shaped profoundly by Christian ideas, so in a sense it was only natural that changes to the Christian model would also eventually have an impact on the understanding of ancient Egyptian beliefs. During the 18th century, there was not much material available to potentially fill this gap in expectations, but scholars were primed to look for evidence of an anthropocentric afterlife in Egypt as well. We can summarize the main developments in the concept of the Egyptian afterlife before Napoleon's invasion in the following way. First, in the absence of written sources came the medieval idea of the Egyptians mummifying their dead in order to preserve their bodies for eternity. With the classical sources entering the picture, Herodotus's ideas of the immortality and reincarnation of the soul gained a central role, sometimes augmented with the Platonic idea of reincarnation as a reward or punishment, as did the ritual before the funeral as described by Diodorus. The latter idea in turn could be tweaked further to understand the judgment not as an earthly ritual as Diodorus explicitly intended, but rather as an afterlife judgment along the lines of the Christian Last Judgment. Correspondingly, the rewards and punishments could not be just the right to burial, but were understood to pertain to the salvation or damnation of the soul in one way or another. This was essentially the traditional model of the early modern period. During the 18th and into the 19th century, this schema was complemented on the one hand by ideas of funerary culture as closely connected with themes of trials and initiation, with more or less explicitly Masonic inspiration, and on the other hand, there was an increasing expectation of a broadly anthropocentric model of the afterlife with such themes as journeys, bodily activities and experiences, and/or spiritual improvement. Another tendency in the later 18th century is the increasing importance of gathering and documenting empirical evidence and, where possible, hold it up against the traditional interpretations. In some areas, such efforts led to increasing skepticism, for example toward Herodotus's and Diodorus's descriptions of embalming procedures. But when it comes to beliefs of mortuary religion, the newly available evidence tended to be fitted into the frameworks that already existed. While this tendency becomes especially clear in the wake of the Napoleonic invasion, it had already started earlier. A good example is George Zoega, whose massive tome in Latin on Egyptian obelisks gathered much of the material available for studying ancient Egypt more generally on the eve of the 18th century. Zoega's work to connect available imagery to the transmitted frameworks shows us the new empiricism at work. Rather than simply drawing on the classical authors, Zoega connects their ideas to scenes like the one depicted here, which had already attracted scholars' attention over half a century earlier because of its overt similarities to depictions of Saint Michael weighing the souls at the Last Judgment in Christian art. On this basis, Zoega connects this scene to existing ideas about afterlife judgment and prominent figures in Egyptian mythology more generally, arriving at the interpretation that what is shown is precisely the traditionally assumed afterlife judgment to determine the future of the souls. With the massive collection and publication efforts following Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, the material available for such connections increased vastly. In reaction to earlier scholarship, there's been a recent tendency to somewhat downplay the pivotal nature of the invasion for subsequent scholarship, but as far as Egyptian mortuary religion is concerned, the Description de l'Égypte offered both material that could directly fill the gap created by recent developments in thinking about the Egyptian afterlife, and interpretations pointing out a direction for them to fulfill this role. The most immediately influential body of the material was the funerary papyri known today as the Book of the Dead, manuscripts of which often contained the weighing of the heart scene, also analysed by Zoega. Its interpretation as an Egyptian counterpart to the Last Judgment in Christian iconography was not only so straightforward that it must have occurred to many scholars independently of each other, but, as we've seen, it also happened to fit perfectly with one of the main themes of what Young would call the received opinion on Egyptian afterlife beliefs. In other words, the seemingly empirical approach actually consisted mainly in connecting traditional ideas with specific imagery. But studying examples of this scene in the context of an entire manuscript allowed Edme-François Chaumard, the prolific contributor and eventual editor of the Description de l'Égypte, to go even further. If the weighing of the heart depicted the Last Judgment, it was only logical to suppose that the rest of the images also depicted different episodes of the afterlife, especially bearing in mind that scholars had been prompted by relatively recent developments in thinking about the afterlife to be on the lookout for signs of an anthropocentric and trial-oriented afterlife, possibilities that would hardly have occurred to earlier, say, 17th century observers. Seemingly, this was exactly what the newly available funerary manuscripts could offer. Deploying a similar interpretive strategy, though one destined for less longevity than his understanding of the weighing of the heart scene, Chaumard identified this scene that he copied from the Book of Gates in the tomb of Ramesses VI in the Valley of the Kings as an illustration of the principle of metempsychosis, also central in earlier interpretations. At the bottom, Chaumard proposed, souls of the deceased persons newly arrived from Earth line up to be judged before the throne of Osiris. Once free from their bodies, the souls fly off in the form of human-headed birds above Osiris, while one unfortunate sinful soul has been doomed to take on the body of a pig, or possibly a hippopotamus, which is being chased back to Earth for a stint in this new form as punishment for its sins. As with the weighing of the heart as depiction of the Last Judgment, this scene provided a welcome correlation between traditional concepts and newly available empirical evidence, and it was frequently cited as such by scholars of the first half of the 19th century. Another turning point in the gradual establishment of the Book of the Dead as the literal description or even guidebook to the afterlife that it's still often presented as was offered by Lepsius' seminal publication of an entire manuscript, to which we still owe many Egyptological conventions, including the chapter numbering and even the very designation of the work as a Book of the Dead, as opposed to the earlier designation preferred by Champollion and his later followers as the funerary ritual. We can get an impression of Lepsius' understanding of the work from a brief section of his description of the first sequence of chapters. It concerns, according to the title, the appearance in light, that is, the transfiguration of the deceased, the final goal of the transmigration of souls. This is shown pictorially just after the funeral in the tomb from which he goes forth alive. All the intermediary steps found no pictorial expression and are only briefly and partially touched upon in the individual chapters." End quote. A couple of things are of particular interest in the present connection. The first has to do with his understandings of the images that had grasped the initial attention of 19th century scholars. In line with earlier ideas, he sees them simply as a convenient illustration of Egyptian afterlife beliefs. If it is illustrated in a funerary composition, the Egyptians believed it would happen in the afterlife. However, the relation between belief and image in his model is slightly more complicated, since Lepsius apparently also reckons with additional intermediary steps that are not illustrated pictorially. The second point has to do with the notion of transmigration of souls, noting here that he understands this as leading ideally to transfiguration. Lepsius uses the German word Seelenwanderung, which offers a productive ambiguity because of the literal meaning being simply wandering of the soul, without necessarily implying the reincarnation in a new body. Lepsius also occasionally uses simply the word wandering alone, showing an inspiration from contemporary anthropocentric ideas about the afterlife as something to be traversed, and a postmortem journey of the soul towards spiritual betterment or transfiguration. Again, it's important to point out that this overall concept of what the afterlife could be would likely not have occurred to earlier scholars, but notably because these intuitions about the Christian afterlife were relatively new, not because of the newly available Egyptian evidence, which was simply interpreted in this mode. While much of the scholarship of the early to mid-19th century sounds quite familiar because the resulting model has been so successful, one exception lies precisely in the prevalence of metempsychosis. This idea was a staple in European interpretations of the Egyptian afterlife until the third quarter of the 19th century, when it was quite abruptly, but almost without explicit debate, phased out. From a modern point of view, it's again tempting to see this as resulting simply from the empirical encounter with the sources. The anthropocentric afterlife journey is copiously attested in the funerary texts, while metempsychosis is not found in the sources. As we've already seen, this was not the case. And in fact, for a while, the pig scene from the Book of Gates played a role for metempsychosis of almost similar importance to that played by the weighing of the heart for the notion of judgment. What seems to be the case instead is that metempsychosis was becoming less and less interesting and necessary for the model. It was originally introduced partly simply because Herodotus said so in one of the very few passages capable of speaking to European questions about ancient Egyptian soul beliefs. But as we saw earlier, it was especially in combination with Plato that reincarnation could be used to establish an Egyptian belief in rewards and punishments in the afterlife. This idea in turn could now be established in a version much closer to Christianity, and thus to expectations, through the weighing of the heart scene, leaving metempsychosis for a while as a sort of subsidiary system of punishment and purgation before a final verdict. However, such processes could also by now be demonstrated by other parts of the Book of the Dead, leaving metempsychosis not only problematically exotic as it had always been, but also conceptually redundant. Note that this fate has much less to do with the actual content of the sources than with the expectations projected onto them. Purely as a matter of principle, just about any activity could be fitted into the model of an anthropocentric afterlife, whereas the kind of imagery that could be interpreted specifically to relate to reincarnation was much more limited. The dropping of metempsychosis and the establishment of the Book of the Dead as a literal description of the anthropocentric afterlife leads us to the late 19th century model, which is virtually identical to the one still with us in modern Egyptology, by fitting into the framework some additional groups of evidence. Notably, amulets and grave goods that were increasingly being catalogued and studied were fitted into the model as so many magical backup systems, in case the person had not actually lived up to the ethical ideas they were judged by. Imagery from tombs and funerary compositions was divided into fates for the blessed and fates for the sinners, giving a deeply textured sense of what the soul would experience after death, depending on the results of the judgment. The idea first presented by Jomard as a hypothesis of the Book of the Dead as a whole being a literal description and depiction of the afterlife had thus become completely entrenched. Another reason that the late 19th century scholarship reads as quite modern is that, unlike earlier scholars, this period saw an increasing effort to avoid overt Christian terminology, often by instead co-opting indigenous terminology without changing the underlying model. However, even though it is sometimes a little less obvious in late 19th century or indeed early 21st century scholarship, the model and its genealogy continues to lie just beneath the surface. This can be shown by the ease with which it can be brought back into the light when expedient, especially for explaining the ideas to broader audiences. Quote, "The Egyptians of every period in which they are known to us believed that Osiris was of divine origin, that he suffered death and mutilation at the hands of the powers of evil, that after a great struggle with these powers he rose again, that he became henceforth the king of the underworld and judge of the dead, and that because he had conquered death, the righteous might also conquer death. End quote. Conceptually, this will sound very familiar, as each of these ideas are clearly derived from Christianity and projected onto a Christ-like Osiris around whom a system of salvation and eternal life is constructed. In this case, however, the parallelism goes to an even deeper structural level, showing us a clear degree of deliberateness on Budge's part. When placing the quote next to the Apostles' Creed, highlighting the parallel sections, it becomes evident that Budge must have been very consciously constructing the analogies for rhetorical purposes, just as people had been doing for over 300 years by his time, and continue, more or less deliberately, to do to this day, simply by using the traditional model. This brings us back to our initial puzzlement over Jung's remark. We've seen how early modern models of the ancient Egyptian mortuary religion were established through Christianizing reinterpretations of classical authors. Although scholars differed in whether they aimed primarily to exoticize or familiarize, in either case, the framework for the description and for choosing which features were significant and how they should be understood remained Christian, as were usually the concerns that led scholars to be interested in ancient Egypt to begin with. Closer to Jung's time, new currents of thought arose in the 18th century, which ended up significantly shaping the 19th century reception of the traditional model. Terrassant's ideas of initiation and trials helped steer expectations in certain directions, as did the broadly compatible notion of an increasingly anthropocentric afterlife, to begin with in Christianity, but spilling over from there into the construction of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. This was the mold within which new sources that were becoming more widely known, not least the Book of the Dead, could be fitted. Our second initial question was why the new evidence did not change the model. We've seen various contributing factors to that effect, but perhaps the main one was the specific combination of breadth and narrowness in the place carved out for the Book of the Dead within the model. It was narrow in the sense that anything found in the Book of the Dead was understood to be about the afterlife and thus beyond empirical testing. As a late 19th to early 20th century scholar like Adolf Ehrman often remarks, if the contents seem contradictory, that's due to the fundamental confusion of the ancient Egyptians, not because there's anything wrong with the interpretive strategy. But at the same time, the scope was broad in the sense that it is difficult to imagine contents that could not have been understood in this way and would thus have falsified the reading principle. An additional feature is that in most cases, the reading was quite eclectic, so that in practice, specific chapters like numbers 110 or 125 became the near exclusive center of attention, especially in more popular or student-oriented writings, and often in redacted versions focusing on the elements that could most easily be fitted into the model, such as the so-called negative confession. Together, this created a remarkably robust framework, almost entirely indifferent to the actual contents of the Book of the Dead. This overview of the historical developments explored in more detail in Yearning for Immortality raises two main questions that I'll address in the remaining part of this talk. The first question concerns the nature of the so-called Book of the Dead, and by extension other ancient Egyptian funerary texts such as the pyramid or coffin texts. If the idea that they conveniently describe and illustrate the Egyptian afterlife in a straightforward and literal fashion has turned out to be little more than a 19th century conjecture made before the text could be read, what kind of reading strategies should we adopt when approaching these compositions today? And secondly, if we cannot use the funerary text as literal descriptions of afterlife belief, then what did the Egyptians believe about the afterlife? Let us address these questions one at a time to sketch what a new approach to ancient Egyptian mortuary religion might look like. To begin with the first question, sidestepping the intuitive expectation that funerary texts describe a 19th century style personal afterlife makes it possible to connect them to much wider patterns of Egyptian uses of text and images. One of the problems the traditional reading has had to contend with is how apparently contradictory the ostensible picture of the ancient Egyptian afterlife is. What the deceased does, whom they meet, and in what order differ not only from one manuscript to the next, but there are often contradictions within a single manuscript as well when read in a literal fashion. The funerary literature is a vast topic. But one of the things that has become increasingly emphasized in recent research is how many of the texts have what is usually called non-funerary origins. Usually this is seen as a case of encroachment of rituals from other domains to the afterlife beliefs. However, if we question the initial assumption that the funerary texts by definition describe the afterlife, the diverse origins of the text appears in a very different light. Rather than thinking of such imports as showing an expanding idea of what happened in the personal afterlife, we can think of them as varying ways of embedding the ancestor in ritual situations that are in one way or another relevant to their new status. Let us look at a couple of examples to show what I have in mind. Firstly, the tradition of assuming that funerary texts are about the afterlife has led to vastly different reading strategies from that used with other ritual texts, even though overtly they look remarkably similar. Let us take an example of how ancient Egyptian ritual texts, whether ones put in tombs or used for other purposes, make use of mythological allusions. The text cited here is a typical example of a healing ritual, where the healing of a child's blisters is effected by identifying the child as the young Horus, kept safe and hale by his mother Isis as he grew up in the Delta marshes. It is understood that this deployment of mythology has relevance only within the ritual situation. It is not an indication of more general beliefs about what happens to someone who gets blisters, but it's one way among numerous possibilities of fitting the real-life problem into a mythological pattern in order to resolve it the way the similar challenge was conquered in the myth. If we had read these lines in a funerary text, however, the traditional perspective would have urged us to read these statements literally and conclude something like, the Egyptians believed that the dead would become Horus in the afterlife. To reiterate, this reading would correspond to the non sequitur that a healing text could be read as showing that the Egyptians believed that a child became Horus when it got blisters, a notion that most Egyptologists would agree would be a fundamental misunderstanding of the use of mythology in this text. The historical overview of the rise of the modern idea of the Egyptian afterlife has highlighted the specious nature of the notion that funerary texts describe the afterlife in a direct fashion. The remedy to this situation that I would propose is to begin reading the funerary text as we would any other Egyptian ritual texts, like the healing spell just quoted. Just like a healing text, the funerary texts are meant to effect the ritual embedding of the ancestor in the ordered world, from the cosmic scale of celestial and agricultural cycles to the social scale of the funeral and ancestor cult. This presents a rather different interpretive problem to that associated with a traditional reading. Rather than shrugging and resorting to cataloguing the different scenarios alluded to in the text as so many, often contradictory, dogmatic beliefs about the afterlife, one would need to consider what ritual situations the text might be associated with, which domains of life they might have come from, and how the ritual roles expressed in them would help in establishing or maintaining the deceased's role as a powerful ancestor. The example here shows one of the more straightforward examples frequently found in the beginning of Book of the Dead scrolls. The owner is posited visually and textually as a solar priest, whereby as an ancestor he is in turn embedded in the solar and Osirian cosmic cycles. In fact, on closer scrutiny, a significant majority of the vignettes in the Book of the Dead shows the owner in precisely this role of worshipping a particular being or group of beings. While we can certainly posit with 19th century scholars that apparently this is the kind of thing that happened in the ancient Egyptian afterlife, we can avoid this framing by simply taking the text and images at face value as presentations of the ritual actions and corresponding cosmic roles of the owner. The approach I recommend then is really only new as far as the reading of funerary texts are concerned. It poses exactly the same questions as we would pose any other Egyptian religious text. What mythological patterns are deployed? How do they relate to the purpose of the ritual in question? What context was the ritual used in as indicated by the text itself, but also other places where the text occurs or other uses of similar ideas? A key difference to the conventional approach lies in the taking seriously of the fact that individual texts seem to have very different origins and that those origins are crucial for understanding their cultural importance. For example, when negative confessions of the kind found in Book of the Dead chapter 125 show up in oaths for priestly initiations and inscriptions presenting purity requirements for entering the inner parts of a temple, This gives us a much more valuable indication of the indigenous cultural context of such recitations than the superficial similarity of the weighing of the heart scene with medieval iconography of the Last Judgment. Let us turn now to the second of our questions. As we've seen, the funerary texts do not show us a literal depiction of the journey of the soul after death. Yet, we're still faced with the same cultural emphasis on funerary culture that has puzzled scholars through centuries. So, what did the ancient Egyptians believe about the afterlife? First, we need to make a note of caution because of the deeply entrenched idea of a very particular kind of afterlife with a journey, trials, rewards, and punishments. As we've seen, this kind of anthropocentric afterlife is very specific for 18th and 19th century Christianity, so we should actually be rather surprised if that turns out to be relevant for ancient Egypt. Because of this traditional association, it might actually be better not to speak of the afterlife in ancient Egypt, or if we choose to do so, we should understand it in very broad terms to signify any kind of continued relations after death, but probably not designating the kind of dynamic and sensory journeys that we have imagined since the 19th century. To answer the question then, we would need to look for the kind of things the Egyptians actually did with and said about the ancestors. We have copious evidence of this from tomb chapels and stelae to the so-called letters to the dead, where ancestors are addressed to solve specific problems for the living. This material has long caused problems for Egyptologists because it presents an image that is much more concrete and interactive than the transcendent afterlife that was assumed to be described in the funerary texts. In the tomb, we see the regular interaction between the living and the ancestor in the offering cult. We witness the busy lives in the funerary domains producing the offerings and see lists of the ritual presentations carried out at different festivals throughout the year. In the letters to the dead, we get the sense of an ancestor continuing to exist in the tomb who remains part of a social relationship to the living with new powers capable of healing, defending, or harming the living, but still part of a quid pro quo exchange of goods and services. Ancestors are vulnerable to living people entering their tombs in an impure state and frequently threaten to take vengeance on visitors violating the norms. Conversely, they can solicit voice offerings from passers-by in order to establish mutually beneficial relations with people that are not necessarily their descendants. Adjacent to the standard custom of family and household members presenting offerings at special occasions, such negotiations provide important insight into how the ancestors were experienced in practice and what an ancestor could do. Through presence in their statues, ancestors can benefit from the rituals not just in the ancestor cult, but also in the divine cult when their images are set up in the local temple. The relations to the deities implied by these practices are similar to the ideas in the funerary texts, where, as we saw, the theme is prevalent of worshipping the gods to maintain cosmic cycles and thereby securing one's own ancestor cult. This picture of the ancestors and their relations to the living, the gods, and the cosmos is rich, nuanced, and changing over time, but there's little room for the kind of 19th century transcendent afterlife that has usually been assumed as a kind of complementary and largely unrelated system attested only in the funerary texts. This is why we should be careful how we pose the question of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. Clearly, the dead continued to exist in very important and tangible ways that we could, in principle, refer to as an afterlife. But since we have a tendency to mean by this a particular set of beliefs in a concrete, otherworldly place where the dead go and continue to do and experience things, even asking what the Egyptians believed about the afterlife can actually get us started with the wrong kind of associations. Finally, of course, we should acknowledge that ancient Egypt is not a monolith. Towards the end of the first millennium, we do begin to see an increasing focus on the idea that the dead have particular experiences. And in the Roman period story of Setna and his son Siosira, we even get a narrative of arriving in a Greek-style underworld where the heart of the dead is weighed, resulting in rewards and punishments. In other words, ideas of postmortem judgment were not solely the invention of early modern scholars, but had already arisen from the contact between Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians. These are exciting historical developments to track, but to be able to do so, we must first acknowledge their relative novelty from an Egyptian point of view, rather than assuming that the Egyptians always held these beliefs simply because they feel more intuitive and expected to us. We've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. We've seen how early modern scholars let their expectations about what the Egyptians might have believed about the afterlife influence the way they read central classical authors like Herodotus and Diodorus. Based on a quite small selection of sources written by Greeks and Romans rather than Egyptians, and filtered through early modern expectations, by the end of the 18th century, scholars largely agreed that the Egyptians believed in an afterlife judgment leading to rewards and punishments depending on a human's behavior during life, worded in terms aligning these beliefs with popular Christianity of the time, and by necessity completely divorced from the Egyptian texts that could not yet be read. When Egyptian sources, and notably the Book of the Dead, became available to scholarly scrutiny from the early 19th century, first its images and later the text came to be understood within this framework. The contents were exotic and mysterious enough to be amenable to this perspective, and shored up by popular narratives about the Egyptians' alleged obsession with death and the afterlife, there seemed to be little reason to question this overall framework, which has survived remarkably intact to the present day, even if it is still deployed as a framing narrative rather than as ideas actually expressed in Egyptian sources. The clear conclusion to this historical inquiry is that we should no longer assume that the Egyptians believed in a concretely conceived anthropocentric afterlife journey of trials, rewards, and punishments, except to the extent we can actually show this to be a plausible contextual reading of the sources. At the end, we briefly explored two corollary questions arising from this critique of the history of the modern idea of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. The first had to do with funerary texts like the Book of the Dead and what they can actually tell us about ancient Egyptian concepts and experiences if they can no longer plausibly be read at the surface level as representing literal descriptions of afterlife beliefs. A key in this new reading strategy invites us to focus on original usage context of the individual recitations. Since we can no longer elide their differences by regarding them all as afterlife descriptions, what we can deduce about their original context becomes crucial for understanding what role they may play in their surroundings in the tomb. Often it is not simply a case of a text having been lifted wholesale from a different context, but rather that it draws on ideas or practices from domains such as the divine cult to create a composition that is specifically relevant for an ancestor. Corresponding to this notion of very permeable boundaries between funerary and non-funerary ritual text and images, we should aim at reading the text as we would any other ritual text, rather than defaulting to a surface engagement where any funerary composition is simply a literal representation of afterlife beliefs. Our second question concerned what we can say about the ancient Egyptian afterlife in light of the proposed rethinking of the funerary literature. For this, we need to turn in the first instance to a different body of material connected to tomb chapels and practices performed there as part of the ongoing ancestor cult. The image painted by this grouping of evidence has always been quite distinct from that emerging from scholarly readings of the funerary text, and we can now begin to see why. The ritualized encounter with the ancestors in their tombs and images are genuinely and clearly attested in ancient Egyptian evidence, while the transcendent postmortem journey through trials and dangerous encounters to achieve eternal life is largely a modern framing narrative, rather than an idea expressed in the ancient sources. As I hope all of this shows, scholars working on Egyptian mortuary religion are in an exciting moment of rethinking centuries-old assumptions at the moment. This means that many questions are still open, such as what cultural context specific parts of the funerary text were derived from, what the different mechanisms are by which funerary texts and images work, and so on. But the fact that we are able to pose and, in the not too distant future, hopefully answer them, holds high promise for stimulating and novel ideas to be coming out of ongoing research on Egyptian funerary culture over the coming years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Yard. Do we have questions? There's time for questions. Glenn?
Yeah, I was wondering what the Europeans made of the earlier texts, coffin texts, pyramid texts, pyramid texts, and the precursors.
Right. So the reason I didn't talk a lot about those is that in the 19th century, focus was very much on the Book of the Dead, and the pyramid texts were published in the late 19th century, and then in turn the coffin text came in the middle of the 20th century. So by and large, the reading of those texts were shaped by the way that the Book of the Dead was already being read. So that's why it's the interpretation of the Book of the Dead that is kind of the formative moment when the idea of funerary text in general and how to read them and what they're about and what place they hold in Egyptian culture was formed. And then the pyramid text and in turn the coffin text were read basically in the same vein.
Thank you.
More question? Oh, Rita.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can say something about the Egyptian term dua.
Yeah.
I mean, there is the whole book.
Yeah. That's a big.
Recently, did you see the book of Sylvia Zado?
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
so
Yeah. So that's a very big topic, and it seems to change quite a lot from being sort of a celestial location in the pyramid text, and then sort of changing over time. We know the New Kingdom Underworld books that can give perhaps the most concrete and detailed sense of what that looked like. There are some overlaps. Obviously, the duat is referred to in various contexts in the funerary texts as well, as we would expect, as kind of a place of regeneration of the son, but also sometimes of the individual deceased. And so it seems to change location and probably changes a significant part of its underlying concepts as well over time. So yes, it really is a topic that needs certainly a whole lecture of its own, or an entire book, as you say. But it raises the question, of course, of how cosmology interacts with the kind of ritual notions that we find expressed in the funerary text. And so notably, I don't think we should again default to the idea that anything described in a funerary text is by necessity something that happens in the duat, which is kind of the corollary of that notion of what the funerary texts fundamentally are, but look more specifically at where and how is that particular cosmic locality deployed in the text, and what other cosmic localities do we see deployed next to it. So it's an interesting question, I think, for thinking about slightly differently and seeing what comes out if we pose a different set of questions where we don't necessarily have a complete overlap of funerary text with duat, but rather there are more specific intersections.
Right. Yeah. No, it's definitely difficult. In fact, even at Zago has been working on this for her dissertation. Even in her conclusion, still,
yes,
it's not the final conclusion. Like, this is the duat.
Right.
I think they wanted it to leave it really ambiguous and.
Yeah, I think that's
so
true. Yes.
My question would be why they did that, right? Why they didn't want to define the duat. I think is connected to.
I think that's right. And I would say that by the very nature of the duat is that it's the place where regeneration takes place, and as always in Egypt, regeneration takes place by dissolving categories, by dissolving outlines, whether it means burying, whether it means wrapping, whether it means swallowing. So we got all of these ideas of sort of containment and dissolving, hiding, and so those kind of regenerative spaces are precisely characterized by not having well-defined outlines and sequences and the kind of things that we associate with the created world. And the duat is inherently something else, quite frustratingly for us when we want to actually find out what the Egyptians thought about it. But I think there is a good reason why it appears to be so fuzzy in many ways.
Thank you.
More questions?
That's okay, thanks. I really enjoyed, or was very interested in the way you pointed out how Christian mythology has been read into Egyptian mythology. But how are we now to read the weighing of the heart and the prayer that's on the heart scarab if they're not about judgment? And presumably a last judgment or a metaphysical judgment.
Right.
What other approaches would we have to understand it?
Yeah, I think I would look at those within a ritual context, because if we look at the text, then we can see, well, there are two very different concepts that are both connected to the weighing of the heart scene. So we have, as you say, the heart scarab spell, chapter 30b, where the idea is that of bringing the heart under control, according to the text, and materially that is instantiated, or that idea is deployed by notionally replacing the heart, of course, with a heart scarab. So that seems to have its quite clear place in the ritual of mummification, and the idea of reconstituting and transforming the body into something else. So the idea that the heart can be out of control, basically, and that is expressed, of course, as it telling bad things about the owner in the Book of the Dead. But if we go back to the coffin text precursors, we have a slightly wider range of ideas or ways in which the heart can go run amok and do things that are not under the control of the owner. So rather than situating that in a sort of legal situation where the heart can arise as a witness, although that is the metaphor that's been used in chapter 30b, I would see it as a broader idea of replacing or perfecting the heart, which is done in the funerary ritual during mummification. Now the chapter 125, if we read the text, then we have the negative confession, of course, which immediately strikes modern viewers as being similar to the Ten Commandments or things like that. So it seems to fit quite well. But there are also other parts of the text that are much more rarely cited, especially towards the end, where there's this interrogation about knowledge of secret names of the entities that the owner needs to pass, but also knowledge about particular rituals. The owner is asked, "What have you done?" And he explains how he's carried out, to us, very obscure rituals that don't really fit well with the notion of an ethical judgment. And so for that reason, those parts are rarely cited when we're reading it today. We're much more interested in the negative confession. But again, if we look at the form of the negative confession, and I think I can't go back to the slide now, but I showed the 2nd century Greek translation of priestly oaths, and I showed the inscriptions from the Edfu temple with the purification recitation labeled. The heading is something like purifying everything that comes into the temple. So that the idea there is clear that it's about making sure that priests who are entering the temple are ritually pure, and to be ritually pure you need to recite this negative confession. So those kinds of ritual contexts, once again, I think gives us a sense of where those ideas are coming from an Egyptian point of view. So we got priestly rituals on the one hand, and we got funerary rituals on the other, and that seems to be quite characteristic when we look at the Book of the Dead as a whole from this kind of angle, that really a lot of the ideas, if not most or all of the ideas, can be derived from different cultural contexts. Of course, those contexts will often be lost to us, but there are indications also in the way that Book of the Dead chapters show up outside of the Book of the Dead on temple walls and so on. So looking more broadly at that and actually posing the questions, where do these ideas come from? What are their associations within ancient Egyptian culture, tends to point in different directions than, at least, well, we should say different possible directions, and different directions that are anchored in aspects of Egyptian culture than the kind of conventional readings where they seem to be completely set apart, right? If we think the weighing of the heart is about a final judgment, why don't people ever talk about the final judgment in their wisdom text or in their letters? Behave yourself or you're going to be eaten by Amu. That's the kind of thing we would expect in a culture that was really obsessed with judgment and the afterlife, and we don't get that. We always have to go to the funerary text and that specific sort of way of reading them.
I think you're entirely right that this notion that the Egyptians were obsessed with death and the afterlife is crazy, but at the same time, there probably isn't an Egyptian way of thinking about this. I mean, if you look at the Lebensmünder, there's all sorts of doubt cast on the whole idea of an afterlife.
Yeah. No, definitely. And again, what we even mean with afterlife is an open question as well, because it's a hugely elastic concept that intuitively we imagine a particular kind of thing, a place maybe where you go and you continue to have experiences that are continuous with your experiences on Earth, and you're carrying out particular activities. But again, that's as intuitive as it feels. It's a pretty modern idea about the afterlife, and we don't really see it. If we go back to even the 17th century, that's not the way that people imagine the afterlife. So as ingrained as it is, it is quite culturally specific. So that's also a reason to be aware when we're talking about the afterlife. What exactly do we mean by that, and what is it most useful for us to mean by that term when we're looking at a culture like ancient Egypt?
Thank you.
Take the academic people to come. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wondering, obviously the focus here is mostly on, the influence of Christian ideas about the afterlife, but as a point of contrast, are there any non-Christian interpretations of Egyptian images of the afterlife? Obviously, modern non-Christian scholars are still going to be very influenced by this framework, but I'm thinking about, for example, medieval and Renaissance Arab scholars, for example, do they have interpretations that are maybe points of contrast?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I talk a little about that even though it's labeled the European invention of the Egyptian afterlife. There is a bit about Arab scholars as well, and one of the striking things is that they really tend on the whole to be much less interested in this kind of thing. So it's not the go-to question. They ask, what did the Egyptians believe about the afterlife, in the way that European scholars are. So even being interested in that question to some extent comes out of particular cultural expectations. But there are interesting ideas in that domain. For instance, they're particularly interested in what you actually find when you go to see Egyptian tombs. And so, for instance, the idea that the Egyptians were buried with all kinds of things is a question that arises. And rather than immediately going to the idea that, that's because they would need them in the afterlife, you get the notion that these are items that belong to the deceased, and that it would be improper for other people to be using. So that's why they were put in the tomb. That some people believe that it's bad luck to be using things that belong to a dead person, and so they put it all in the tomb. So it's a very different sort of way of explaining what you see, and ultimately a different approach, because there are different expectations about what it all means and what it should mean for an ancient people to be putting a lot of energy into funerary culture, basically.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, how would you interpret the very few references to the punishments of chapter 1 in the teaching of Merikara into this framework?
Yeah, I wonder if that's what they are at all. I would say they use very different vocabulary to what we find in the funerary texts. So that's something, and I'm quoting it relatively freely here, about the deeds being stacked up in a heap or something like that. And so if you have the strong expectation that the Egyptians were thinking about an afterlife judgment all the time, even at a time when it's not otherwise really attested, because it's well before the weighing of the heart scene, then yes, you can read that into it. But we would have to admit that the words and the metaphors, the expressions that are being used, the concepts that are deployed, are completely different. So it's sort of an associative connection to that idea that I think is probably not the only one. It's pretty obscure, admittedly, what's going on in that passage and a couple of others like it, but I don't think that's all the more reason, I think, that we should be careful with immediately explaining, oh, of course, this is exactly what they mean by this. We know all about that. But yes, those of course come up in that. Those are some of the very few instances where people have actually argued that there are references outside the funerary text, because otherwise, again, the funerary text are where we go when we want to attest these ideas. And the Egyptians don't seem to have talked a lot about them outside the funerary text.
My question is about, starting from this art, the Deir Medina art, where the artists were painting their own tombs and obviously having their own interpretation of things. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that they actually imagined that the lifestyle that they're portraying in the tombs would be their future in the afterlife?
I don't think that's necessarily what they were thinking when they were making these paintings. So one thing that's always been a little odd about this is from the vignette of Book of the Dead, chapter 110, where we see the owner of the Book of the Dead working in the field, harvesting, plowing, and doing things like that. And since the early 19th century, that has been understood as an ancient Egyptian equivalent to the Elysian fields. There's this idea in Greek and Roman ideas about the Elysian fields, that you will do the kind of things that you love doing during life. You're going to continue doing those in the Elysian fields. So that's kind of our afterlife of eternal bliss. Now, I don't think elite members from ancient Egypt, painters in the Deir Medina tombs, were really dreaming of an eternity of toiling in the fields. So there's a kind of clash there that's coming out of the interpretive overlay that we have applied to this. Now we might say, oh, but that's why they had shanties, as people often do. But then we're beginning to connect ideas that, again, do not seem to be connected by the Egyptians for it to make sense in our own sort of framing narrative about the Egyptian ideas. So I wouldn't see this as a literal representation of what Senedjem imagined would happen in the afterlife. It's a representation of Senedjem as the god Hetep securing the world's fecundity, which in turn benefits his own ancestor cult. That's the picture we get if we read the accompanying text, and I think that's as good a guide as we have to what the Egyptians themselves were thinking about this.
Well, that's a good answer, because I'm also wondering about the tombs of the nobles where they've illustrated all their jobs in real life.
Right.
With the hunting and with the craftsmen who made things.
Yeah.
And that they were in charge of. Are those sort of boasts that they were making for any prospective visitors to the tomb?
I think that's a fair assumption, especially
and the ritualistic things would be in the king's tombs.
Well, but also in the inner part of the T-shaped chapels, right? So the outer part, the first thing you see is there's a giant picture of Amenhotep III and the loyal service of the tomb owner to the king and those kind of things. Yes. And yes, I think that's straightforwardly meant to wow people who are entering. This is a really important person whose tomb I'm in now. I better behave myself and bring offerings and so on. But then in the inner part, you see representations of the funerary rituals, of scenes with the deities, and sort of more ritual. Again, probably not literal depictions of the afterlife, but images positing and establishing the kind of relationships to the deities and the cosmos that you would want an ancestor to have. So different parts of the tomb, I think, do quite different things, corresponding to the quite different motifs that we find depicted there.
Please go ahead.
Later dynasties of Egypt already saw early funerary texts and structures as in antiquity during their own lifetime. So is it possible that like later dynasties reinterpreted these practices in their own and possibly changed their meaning?
Absolutely. I think that's very likely, and that in some cases perhaps they were even used without having much sense of their original use context. If you think of the late period reuse of pyramid text, for instance, there won't have been much specific ideas about what exactly the kings of the late Old Kingdom did with these texts. But on the other hand, they would be clearly recognized as being similar to the kind of text that was still in use, or at least in use more recently, and that would be the idea that they were appropriate to put in a tomb. So I think it's likely that they lived a life of their own, separate from whatever origin, and that we don't even have to have those huge time spans either. We can see, for instance, what becomes Book of the Dead, chapter 148, occurs first in a late Middle Kingdom stela devoted to the ancestor cult. And so to what extent people knew of that connection and simply updated the text by adding vignettes so that it fitted into the new context, or how it was reinterpreted is, I think, an open and interesting question. But clearly, since we're dealing with a tradition that's spanning literally millennia, it stands to reason that interpretations would not have remained the same, especially when we are looking at things that were clearly rediscovered rather than being the result of a sort of ongoing transmission, unbroken transmission through time.
Any more questions? Well, let's thank Dr. Muir for coming for the talk, and we have one copy left of his book if you are interested, and I hope you will join us January 11th on Zoom for Female Utopian Socialists in Egypt, and on the 26th here in Berkeley for Rachel Barnes, and she is the Son of Boston. Thank you very much for coming.